My hands were steady when I signed the treaty. That was the hardest part, keeping them steady. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to laugh. The Hall of Concordance on Vareth Prime smelled like copper and something sweet, almost like burnt sugar, which I had learned was the natural scent the Varathi released when they felt victorious. The entire chamber reeked of it. 600 of them watched from the gallery above, their 6 iridescent eyes catching the pale light that poured through the crystal dome overhead. They were beautiful, in the way that a predator is beautiful, all sharp angles and slow, deliberate movement. They had been watching us for 11 years with the patience of something that believed it had already won. I was Commander Yara Voss. My official title was Lead Human Diplomatic Representative to the Varathi Dominion. That was the title on the treaty document. My real title lived inside a folder that did not exist in any civilian database, and it used different words entirely. I pressed the stylus to the holographic surface and drew my name in long, clean letters. Behind me, I heard the Varathi gallery release a collective breath. High Consul Marath stood at the far end of the long obsidian table, all 7 feet of him, his ceremonial robe shifting between deep violet and silver, as his body temperature rose slightly with pleasure. He thought this was the end of something. He was correct about that, at least, though not in the way he imagined. I had read the treaty 41 times. My team had read it more than that. The document was 1,012 pages long in its holographic format, translated across 3 diplomatic layers, and cross-referenced against 18 prior agreements. It was, by any standard, a masterpiece of legal architecture, beautifully written, precise in language, and almost impossible to fully read in the 6 weeks the Varathi had allotted for review. Almost. On page 312, buried inside a subclause about mineral resource management in disputed outer territories, was a paragraph that transferred full extraction rights for 17 human outer colony mining systems to the Varathi Dominion for a period of not less than 90 years. The ore from those systems, a compound we called Harvanite, was the single most important raw material in the construction of human deep space warship hulls. Without it, our shipyards would slow to a crawl within 3 years and stop completely within 5. We had found it on the first night. A young analyst named Owen, 26 years old, working on his 4th cup of coffee at 2 in the morning, had flagged it with shaking hands and sent the report up the chain so fast that it reached Admiral Cho Renji before sunrise. I had been in the Admiral's office when she read it. She set the report down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and then she looked at me with those flat, dark eyes of hers and said, "They think we missed it." "Yes," I said. "Good," she said. "Let them keep thinking that." That conversation was 8 months ago. We had signed nothing that morning. We had asked for more time to review, citing translation complexity, which the Varathi graciously granted because they believed we needed it. We did not need it for translation. We needed it for construction. As I finished my signature and stepped back from the table, Marath moved toward me with both of his primary arms extended, which was the Varathi gesture for mutual completion, the closest thing they had to a handshake. I extended my own hand, and he enclosed it in his long, pale fingers, and I smiled at him with every muscle in my face. "Commander Voss," he said, his voice carrying that low harmonic resonance the Varathi used when they spoke standard, like 2 notes played at once. "Today marks the beginning of a new era between our peoples." "It does," I agreed, and I meant it completely, though not in the way he thought. There was a ring on my right hand. It had been there for 8 months. It looked like a simple silver band, the kind a person might wear for sentiment. The biosensor built into its inner surface was keyed to my pulse and pressure, and when I pressed it flat against a conductive surface while my heart rate held below 60 beats per minute, it sent a compressed data packet to a relay station, 11 light-years away. I had pressed it against the treaty desk as I signed. The packet was 2 words. We confirmed. Somewhere in human space, in a location that appeared on no official chart, that signal was received by a man named Captain Dre Okafor, who was not a civilian freighter captain no matter what his manifest said. He read the 2 words on his display, nodded once to himself, and gave a quiet order to his crew. I did not know the specifics of what happened next. I did not need to. I had been told enough to understand the shape of it, and the shape was elegant. 18 months of peace. 18 months in which the Varathi believed they were watching us scramble to honor a treaty we did not fully understand, while their fourth fleet assembled quietly in the Kethis Nebula. 18 months in which we did something else entirely. The banquet that followed the signing was long and elaborate. I ate food I could not name, drank something pale and cold that tasted faintly of pine, and spoke pleasantly with a dozen Varathi dignitaries who all smelled of victory and sugar. I answered their questions carefully. I laughed when they expected laughter. I was gracious and warm and attentive, and inside I was absolutely, perfectly calm. I thought about Owen at 2 in the morning, his coffee going cold, his eyes running down page 312. I thought about Admiral Cho, setting that report down like it was made of glass. I thought about the billion people who had died in the 3 wars that came before this treaty, and the billions more who were alive right now, on colony worlds and station rings and spinning habitats, who did not know what had almost happened to them. They would not know for a while longer. That was all right. Some things are only understood in the rear view, when you can see the full distance you have traveled. By the time I returned to my quarters that night, the treaty was filed, certified, and distributed across 17 legal systems. It was binding. It was real. The Varathi celebrated in their halls above me, their voices carrying down through the walls in something that might have been music. I sat at the small desk in my room and wrote a single line in my personal log, which was encrypted to a standard the Varathi had never seen and would not understand if they had. The line read, "Signatures complete. 18-month clock starts now." Then I closed the log, lay down on the narrow bed, and slept for 9 hours without interruption. It was the best sleep I had in years. Not because I felt safe, because I knew what was coming, and I knew we were ready. And sometimes that quiet certainty is the most restful thing in the universe. The Varathi dreamed of what they had taken from us. We dreamed of what we were building. Captain Dre Okafor had been flying under false colors for so long that he sometimes forgot what honest paperwork looked like. The manifest on his ship, a mid-range cargo hauler registered under the name Settler's Luck, listed its cargo as agricultural support systems, irrigation controllers, soil processors, hydration regulators, seed cultivation modules. Standard equipment for a colony world trying to improve its yield. Nothing that would make a Varathi border inspector reach for a scanner. The reality was different. Every crate in Bay 3 was a pre-assembled Mjolnir-class rail cannon component, broken down into segments that matched the weight and electromagnetic profile of irrigation hardware, sealed inside housing units that were themselves components of the cannon's outer casing. It was like a weapon inside a weapon, carrying itself across the border in disguise. Dre had been doing this run for 6 months. His crew of 11 knew what they were carrying. Every one of them had signed something that went far beyond a standard non-disclosure agreement. They were civilians on paper. In every way that mattered, they were not. The morning after Commander Voss signed the treaty, Dre received her signal. 2 words, compressed, encrypted, bounced across 4 relay points before it reached him. He was at the navigation console when it came through, eating a bread roll he had made himself, because the ship's food processor had opinions about texture that he disagreed with. He read the words. He finished the bread roll. Then he leaned over the intercom and said, "Petra, we are go for the new routing. Plot me a course to Harvin Station, secondary approach, and don't use the corridor we used last time." "Already plotted," said the voice on the other end. That was his first officer, Lieutenant Petra Ward, 29 years old, excellent navigator, completely genuine in her belief that Settler's Luck was exactly what it appeared to be. She thought they were running agricultural aid to outer colonies. She thought Dre was a contractor with a government logistics contract and a preference for unconventional routes. She was one of the smartest people he had ever worked with, and the fact that she did not know the truth was something he carried quietly, like a stone in his pocket that he never put down. He justified it the way he justified most things in this work. She was safer not knowing, and the mission was safer with her not knowing. And someday, soon, he hoped, She would know everything, and he would deal with whatever came from that conversation when it arrived. Dre had been given the full picture by Admiral Cho herself, in a room so stripped of electronics that the walls looked bare and unfamiliar. She had laid it out in her usual way, which was to say she laid it out like a mathematical proof, starting with what was known, moving through what was observed, and ending at the only conclusion the evidence supported. The Varathi had inserted the mining clause deliberately. They had done it to eliminate humanity's ability to build warships at scale. They intended to honor the treaty for exactly 18 months, using that time to position their Fourth Fleet for a final offensive, one that would come while humanity was supposedly at peace, while our guard was down and our shipyards were slowing. The plan was precise and it was patient and it was, in its own way, brilliant. The Admiral had looked at him across the bare table and said, "So we are going to use those same 18 months. The operation had a name that Dre had never said aloud in mixed company. It ran across 43 human-operated vessels, most of them registered as civilian, all of them running cargo that their manifest described as something other than what it was. Over the course of 18 months, those ships would deliver enough Mjolnir components to arm 140 colony worlds. They would carry drone swarm launchers disguised as atmospheric processors, orbital denial platforms packed inside ice mining equipment, power cores labeled as medical refrigeration units. Humanity was not slowing its military construction. It was moving it underground, literally and figuratively, and it was spreading it across the widest possible surface area, so that no single point of failure could undo what they were building. The Varathi inspectors at border checkpoints were thorough by any civilian standard. They scanned manifests, ran electromagnetic sweeps, occasionally opened crates for physical inspection. They were not, however, looking for something designed to fool them. They were looking for the thing they expected to find. A frightened species under treaty, doing its civilian business, perhaps scrambling behind the scenes but not in any way that would change the outcome. Every ship in the network had been built to pass that exact level of scrutiny. No more, no less. Dre pulled into Harvin Station 3 days later and spent 6 hours on the dock while his crew rested, and the crates moved from his hold to a warehouse that was registered to a mining cooperative that did not, in any meaningful sense, exist. The dock foreman was a tall, quiet woman named Celia Grant, who shook his hand without ceremony and handed him a new manifest for his next run. He did not look at the manifest until he was back aboard. When he did, he saw that his next cargo was listed as water reclamation equipment, which was going to a colony called Dural 7. He knew what was actually in those crates. He did not need to check. 14 days into the run, they passed through a Varathi inspection corridor at the edge of the Palin system. The inspector who boarded was young, efficient, and thorough. He walked the cargo bay with a scanner that Dre knew could detect 17 different types of prohibited materials. The scanner moved across the stacked crates without pause. The readings came back clean, because the shielding on each crate had been calibrated specifically to that model of scanner. Humanity's intelligence division had obtained 3 of them the year before, through channels that Dre did not ask about. The inspector signed off on the manifest, shook Dre's hand with his secondary arm in the Varathi style, and left. Petra watched him go from the doorway of the forward corridor, then turned to Dre and said, "They're getting more careful, aren't they? More inspections than last quarter." "Trade volume is up," Dre said. "They're managing flow." Petra accepted this. She was not suspicious by nature, which was part of why she was good at her job. She trusted the data in front of her. "Water reclamation equipment," she said, glancing at the manifest. "For Dural 7. Those colonists are going to be very hydrated." "Very hydrated," Dre agreed. Petra smiled and went back to the navigation console, and Dre stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the closed cargo bay door, thinking about the fact that the Varathi Fourth Fleet was currently 6 months from readiness in the Kethis Nebula. He knew this because their signals intelligence, routed through 3 layers of cover so deep it would take a decade to untangle, had confirmed it 48 hours ago. 6 months for them, 5 for humanity. They were ahead, not by much, but ahead. He walked back to the bridge, sat down, and ate another bread roll. The navigator plotted the next jump. The stars outside the viewport shifted and blurred, and then snapped into the new pattern of a different part of space. And Dre Okafor flew his fake cargo across the dark under a flag that was real, even if the name on the ship was not. And he thought about all the people on Durrell 7 who would sleep safer without ever knowing why. He was all right with that. Some protections only work when they are invisible. 3 weeks later, a report crossed his desk, forwarded through the chain with a quiet flag on it, that the Varathi had moved their staging timeline forward by 2 weeks. The Fourth Fleet would be ready in 4.5 months. Humanity now had 5 months of lead time, adjusted to 3. Dre looked at the numbers. He ran the delivery schedule in his head against the deployment timeline. He sent one message up the chain. No words, just a request to confirm the updated supply routing to 11 colonies that had not yet received their final shipments. The response came back in 4 hours. Confirmed. Routing updated. They were still ahead. He deleted the message and went to sleep. The banquet on Vareth Prime had better food the second time around. 6 months into the treaty period, the Varathi hosted what they called a Progress Review Summit, which was their way of assessing how completely humanity had accepted the terms of an agreement they intended to break. I had been invited specifically by the High Consul's office, which meant Mareth wanted to look at me. I was happy to be looked at. The event was held in the same Hall of Concordance where we had signed, but the arrangement was different. Smaller tables, softer light, the kind of setting designed for private conversation rather than ceremony. I wore the diplomatic uniform in navy and silver, my rank pin on the left collar, and I arrived exactly on time, which the Varathi read as a sign of moderate respect. Arriving early would have suggested anxiety. Late would have suggested arrogance. On time was the calculation I wanted them to make about me. I spent the first hour moving through the room doing what diplomats do, exchanging pleasantries, accepting compliments on the spirit of cooperation, asking polite questions about Varathi cultural events I had no real interest in. I was good at this. I had been doing it since I was 23 years old, when I first entered the diplomatic corps, and I had been doing it in its deeper, more complicated form, since I was 31, when Admiral Cho had introduced herself to me in a corridor after a conference, and suggested I might be suited for work that was more interesting than treaty reviews. I had been 31 for 15 years. Marath found me near the mineral water station, the human delegation's addition to the catering, since we could not metabolize most Varathi beverages, and he did something he had never done in any of our previous interactions. He sent everyone else away with a small gesture of his secondary arms, and spoke to me quietly, with the particular intimacy of someone who believes they are about to enjoy themselves at your expense. "Commander Voss," he said, "I want to speak with you honestly." "I welcome that," I said. I meant it even more than he knew. What followed was 12 minutes of the most interesting conversation I had in that entire year. Marath, with the relaxed confidence of someone who has already won, laid out the broad shape of what the Varathi had done. Not in explicit detail, he was too careful for that, but in the way that powerful people sometimes speak when they want you to understand how thoroughly you have been outmaneuvered. He spoke about resource management, about strategic positioning, about how the future of the outer colonies would require careful administration by those best equipped to provide it. He referenced, without naming it directly, the mining clause. He spoke about how certain human industrial capacities might find themselves redirected in coming years. He was telling me they had already won. He was doing it because he wanted to see how I reacted. He was doing it because there is a particular pleasure in revealing a trap to someone after they have walked into it. I looked at him with careful attention. I did not let my expression change toward anything that could be read as alarm or understanding. I let my eyes show a faint confusion. Not stupidity. The Varathi were not impressed by stupidity, but the kind of careful uncertainty of someone who suspects they are hearing something important, but cannot quite decode it. I let him finish. Then I said, "High Consul, I think I understand what you're describing, and I want you to know that humanity takes its treaty obligations very seriously. We are committed to the terms we signed." Marath's 6 eyes adjusted. A slight shift in focus that, in Varathi body language, indicated satisfaction. He believed I had heard a warning and chosen compliance. He believed I was telling him we would not resist. He was half right. We had no intention of resisting the way he expected. Inside, I noted every implication of what he had just told me. He had confirmed the timeline. He had confirmed the intention. He had confirmed that the Varathi leadership believed we were exactly where they wanted us. That was useful. Not because it changed anything. We had known all of this. But because confirmation from the source had a different quality than intelligence gathered from the outside. It was the difference between believing a door is locked and watching someone press the key into it. After the conversation, I moved back into the general flow of the event and spent 20 minutes talking with a junior Varathi official about a cultural exchange program that was going to happen in exactly the same way that my ship carried irrigation equipment. It was real on paper, and something else entirely in function. The junior official was enthusiastic and took detailed notes. Late in the evening, Meredith called the room to attention and offered a toast to sustained cooperation. Every Varathi raised their crystal glass. I raised mine. We drank together in that sweet-smelling hall, and the High Consul smiled at me across the room, and I smiled back with everything I had. The thing about being the person who knows the full picture is that it changes how every interaction feels. When the Varathi laughed that night, I heard people who believed they were watching a story with a fixed ending. When I smiled, I was smiling at the distance between what they thought was happening and what was actually in motion. That distance, measured in months and light years and concealed cargo and silent preparations, was the most important space in the known universe right then. I had given Meredith something during our conversation, a real thing, not a lie. I had mentioned, carefully, that there was a faction within human political circles that was vocally unhappy with the treaty, calling it a betrayal of national sovereignty, demanding that humanity pull back from the agreement. I had framed it as an embarrassment, something our government was managing, a piece of internal noise that complicated our diplomatic position. It was true. The faction existed. What I did not tell Meredith was that the faction had been encouraged into existence, quietly, by people 2 levels above my clearance, specifically, to give the Varathi the impression that humanity was fractured and distracted. The protests were real. The protesters believed in their cause. The cause itself had been seeded into the right channels at the right time, cultivated like a garden, because a divided humanity was exactly the kind of humanity the Varathi expected to find when they came back with the 4th Fleet. That expectation was going to cost them. Alone in my quarters that night, I did not write in my log. I sat at the desk and looked at the wall and thought for a long time about the weight of what I was carrying. Not guilt exactly. Guilt implies that you had a better option and chose the worse one. This was something else. It was the feeling of being the person in the room who knows where all the exits are, and understanding that knowing this means you are also responsible for the people who do not. Petra Ward crossed my mind, though I had never met her. I knew about her from Dre Okafor's operational reports. First officer on Settler's Luck. Genuine, loyal, unaware of the full picture. There were thousands of Petras in this operation. Good people doing real work, some of it deceptive, some of it not. Almost none of them seeing the entire shape of what they were part of. I thought about page 312. I thought about Owen, the analyst who found it, who was now working 18-hour days in a deep classification facility that did not appear on any map. I thought about Admiral Cho's face when she said the words, "Let them keep thinking that." I had made my peace with what we were doing a long time ago. That peace had been hard-won, purchased over years of looking at casualty reports from the 3 wars and asking myself what number was large enough to justify the thing we were now doing. I had arrived at an answer I could live with, though I did not enjoy it. The answer was, whatever number keeps that column from growing. I went to sleep. Outside my window, the lights of Vareth Prime glittered across the dark, in patterns I had learned to read like a second language. Somewhere in that darkness, 6 months from now, everything was going to change. We were going to be ready. Admiral Cho Renji did not believe in making dramatic speeches. She believed in clear orders, accurate data, and sleep. 3 things that were almost impossible to maintain simultaneously in the final weeks before an operation of this scale. But she tried. The command center at Earth Orbital Defense Headquarters had been running on reduced lighting for a week to lower the electromagnetic footprint, which meant everyone looked like they were working inside a photograph from some earlier, dimmer era of history. Cho found she did not mind. Dim light was good for thinking. The report on her screen at 0230 on a Tuesday confirmed what their intelligence had been building toward for months. The Varathi Fourth Fleet, 218 vessels, ranging from scout frigates to heavy command ships, had completed its assembly in the Kethis Nebula and was moving into pre-jump position. Based on calculated FTL entry angles and fleet formation, their first targets would be the outer colony worlds of Harvan, Dural 7, and the Palin system, the three systems with the highest concentration of Harvanite ore processing facilities. After those, they would push inward toward the core systems, expecting to meet a military force that had spent 18 months running down its warship production. They were going to find something very different. Cho read the report twice, made 3 small corrections to the fleet positioning orders that had been staged and ready for 11 days, and then called the night duty officer over. "Get me a count on activation readiness for all 140 colony defense grids," she said. "Not the summary, the actual numbers, system by system." The duty officer, a young man named Kieran Walsh, had been on this shift for 4 months and had learned not to show surprise at anything the Admiral asked for at any hour. He brought the numbers in 40 minutes. Cho reviewed them. 137 systems at full readiness, 2 at 94%, 1 at 88%, because of a power supply delay in the orbital denial platform installation that had been flagged, escalated, partially resolved, and reflagged over a period of 3 weeks. She looked at that one for a while. 88% was not full. It was also not nothing. She made a note to redirect one of Okafor's sister ships, which was currently 2 days out with a scheduled delivery to Harvan, to reroute to that system first and drop the remaining power components before the window closed. Then she went back to her desk and ate half a meal that had gone cold and thought about timing. The Varathi fleet was 4 days from jump-capable range. Their most likely insertion point was a fold space corridor near the edge of the Palin gravity well, which their navigation protocols strongly preferred for large fleet movements. Cho's teams had known about this preference for 8 months, and had spent 6 of those months placing things in that corridor that did not appear on any sensor sweep. The Varathi ran at their standard detection frequencies. The Varathi ran standard sweeps. That was the thing about an enemy who believed they were winning. They do what is sufficient, because sufficient is all that is required when the other side is not fighting back. Cho had spent her career studying what happened when that assumption met its opposite. On the 3rd day, she called a final briefing for the 13 senior officers who had been cleared for the full operational picture. They assembled in the deep shielded room that Cho had taken to calling the reading room, because it was the only place in the facility where you could actually think without wondering who else could hear you. She stood at the head of the table and looked at the faces around her, tired, alert, carrying the particular expression of people who had held a secret for a very long time and could see the end of that particular wait approaching. She did not give a speech. She went through the checklist. System by system, element by element, she confirmed readiness, flagged the 2 systems at less than full capacity, reassigned the resources that could address them, and updated the activation sequence timeline by 6 hours to account for the Varathi fleet's slightly faster than predicted transit speed. At the end, she looked around the table and said, "They are coming because they believe we are unprepared. Every choice we have made for 18 months has been aimed at maintaining that belief. That work is done. Now we let them arrive." Nobody cheered. Nobody made any particular expression at all. That was exactly right, Cho thought. This was not the moment for noise. The 4th day arrived on schedule. At 0300 hours, the first long-range sensor alert came through. Varathi fleet signatures detected crossing into the Palin approach corridor. Cho was at her station, coffee in hand, and she told the duty staff to hold all active transmissions and log everything passively. The Varathi fleet was moving in tight formation, exactly as predicted. They had clearly rehearsed this. They were precise and confident, and they had no idea what was waiting for them. At 0317, the Varathi flagship opened a broad-spectrum communication channel and broadcast a message in standard to every human installation in range. The message was pre-recorded. Cho could tell by the audio signature, which meant they had written it weeks ago, perhaps months. It said that the Varathi Dominion was moving to enforce the terms of the treaty, that certain violations of the mining rights clauses had been detected, and that human military assets were ordered to stand down and submit to inspection. The message ended with a statement that resistance would be met with decisive and overwhelming force. Cho listened to the whole message. She noted that Marath's voice was in the recording, a formal touch, meant to signal that this came from the highest authority. She set her coffee down. At 0318, she gave a single order. All systems, activate. What happened next was not a battle in the sense that implies two sides discovering each other and reacting. It was something closer to the closing of a door, a thing that had been precisely engineered, moved into position over 18 months, and now simply shut. On 140 worlds, in 62 star systems, every concealed defense installation that humanity had built during the peace treaty period came online simultaneously. The orbital denial platforms that had been sleeping under ice erupted through the surface and filled their assigned defensive grids. The Mjolnir rail batteries that had arrived on ships registered as agricultural support fired their initialization sequences and came to full charge in the 52 seconds their engineers had promised. The drone swarms launched in counts that, added together across all systems, constituted the largest simultaneous defensive deployment in human history. In the Palin corridor, the Varathi Fourth Fleet came out of their approach pattern and straight into a sensor environment that was suddenly, overwhelmingly full. Their targeting computers registered contacts in numbers that could not be correct, except they were correct, and the fleet's tactical officers had perhaps 3 seconds to understand this before the first denial platforms activated and the corridor closed behind them. On the flagship, Varathi Admiral Sekthus looked at his command display and saw something that had no framework in his training or his experience. He had been told that humanity was scrambling, divided, barely maintaining its civilian infrastructure. His intelligence had confirmed this. His inspectors had passed through dozens of human installations and found nothing unusual. And yet here, spread across his entire strategic display, was evidence of a construction program so large and so well hidden that it could only have been built during the period he had believed was working in his favor. He opened a comm channel to the human flagship, Cho's command station, technically, though Cho herself was in the orbital facility. And when his image appeared on Cho's display, his 6 eyes were moving in the irregular pattern that Varathi physiologists described as deep cognitive disruption. He was trying to make sense of something that his entire framework of understanding had told him could not exist. Cho looked at him for a moment. Then she said, clearly and without raised voice, "Admiral Sekthus, you gave us peace. We used it. That is the thing about us. Give us time, and we build. Give us a reason, and we do not stop." Sekthus said nothing for almost 15 seconds. When he spoke, it was not in standard. He said something in Varathi that the translation unit rendered as, "You were never unprepared." "No," Cho said, "we were not." The engagement that followed lasted 9 hours and 14 minutes. It was not a battle in the traditional sense. Cho had structured the defensive network specifically to make the traditional battle impossible. The Varathi fleet, trapped in a corridor with denial platforms ahead and behind, facing defense grids on every approach vector, had one real option: negotiate. 3 hours in, Sekthus requested a pause in hostilities. 6 hours in, he requested a formal channel to the human diplomatic corps. 9 hours in, he agreed to a standstill. Not a retreat, not a surrender, a standstill, which was exactly what Cho had been aiming for. A retreat would have humiliated the Varathi so completely that the political fallout might produce something worse than what they had already planned. A surrender would have done the same. What Cho wanted was a Varathi military that was stopped, that understood it had been stopped, but that still had enough integrity intact to go back to Varath Prime and have a different conversation with its political leadership. She had thought about this for a long time. The goal was never to destroy the Varathi. The goal was to make them understand that their assumptions about humanity were wrong in ways that could not be corrected by superior numbers or better tactics. The goal was a different kind of peace, one built on accurate information about what humanity actually was. Kieran Walsh, the night duty officer who had learned not to show surprise, showed surprise when the standstill agreement came through. He looked at the display and then at the Admiral and said, quietly, "Is it over?" Cho considered the question. "The part that was going to go badly for us," she said, "is over. Yes." Then she picked up her coffee, found it had gone cold again, and asked someone to make a fresh pot. She looked at the display for a long time after that, at the Varathi fleet, sitting still in the Palin corridor, and she thought about Yara Voss on Vareth Prime, signing her name in long, clean letters while the High Consul smelled of victory and sweet burning sugar. She thought about Dre Okafor and his bread rolls, and his first officer who had thought she was delivering water reclamation equipment. She thought about Owen, the analyst, page 312, 2 in the morning, coffee going cold. She thought about the one system that had been at 88% readiness, and was relieved to see that it had not been targeted in the initial approach. Then she wrote her operational report, which was 4 pages long, and said, in its summary section, simply, "The operation achieved its objectives. Further diplomatic engagement recommended." I was in my quarters on Vareth Prime when the standstill confirmation came through. It arrived as a single line of text on a device that was, officially speaking, a personal music player. I read it once. Then I put the device away and sat very still for a moment. 12 months. That was how long it had been since I had signed the first treaty in this same city, in the hall that was 2 streets away from where I was sitting now. 12 months of carrying the weight of what I knew, of sleeping in rooms that smelled of copper and sweetness, of smiling at people who believed they were watching us fall into a trap that no longer existed by the time they sprung it. The following morning, I was asked to attend an emergency session of the Varathi High Council. I dressed carefully and walked to the Hall of Concordance through streets that were quieter than usual. News travels quickly in political cities, even when people do not know exactly what has happened, and the Varathi I passed looked at me with expressions I had not seen before. Not anger, not defeat, something more complicated, the expression of a person who has just learned that they did not know what they thought they knew. The session was unlike any I had attended. The usual formality was gone. Mareth was not present. His absence was explained with a brief phrase that translated as administrative reassignment, which in Varathi political language meant something that no one in the chamber was ready to say directly. In his place sat Councillor Vea, who was younger than I expected, with lighter coloring than most Varathi I had met, and a habit of speaking more slowly, as if she wanted to be sure she was understood. She looked at me across the council floor and said, in very careful standard, "Commander Voss, we need to begin a different conversation." "Yes," I said. "I believe we do." What followed was 3 weeks of talks that were unlike anything in the diplomatic record between our species, because they were honest, not comfortable, honest. The Varathi were not apologetic, and I did not ask them to be. I was not triumphant, and they did not expect me to be. We were 2 parties that had been engaged in a very complicated deception and counter-deception, and we were now sitting across from each other knowing the full picture, and we were trying to figure out what to build from that. Lieutenant Petra Ward came to Vareth Prime 6 weeks after the standstill. Dre Okafor had told her everything before she arrived, not because the security classification had been lifted, but because the point of maintaining her ignorance no longer served any operational purpose, and because she deserved to know. She arrived with the expression of someone who has processed a very large amount of information and is still working through its implications. She found me on the 2nd day, in the corridor outside the main negotiating chamber. She was quieter than I expected, given what I had heard about her from Okafor's reports. Was there another way? She asked me. She did not specify which part she was asking about. I understood she meant all of it. I thought about it honestly. Not to give her a diplomatic answer, but to actually think about it the way she was asking me to. Maybe, I said. There might have been a version of this that was less hidden, less built on concealment. I don't know if it would have worked. I know that this one did, and that we are both still here to have the argument about whether it should have gone differently. Petra looked at me for a moment. That's not really an answer, she said. No, I agreed. It isn't. She thought about that. Then she said, Okafor sends his regards. He's already running a new route. Legitimate cargo this time, I'm told. What kind? Medical supplies. For Dural 7, actually. I nodded. That was something. Counselor Vea had sought me out 3 days into the formal talks with a question she delivered in a low voice, as if she was not entirely sure she should be asking it. She said she had studied human history, an obsession of hers since she was young, apparently, and that her people had a word for the thing humanity had done over the course of the past 18 months. She said the word, and the translation unit rendered it in standard as something that did not quite work as a phrase. It came out as the patience of something that intends to survive. I asked if that was meant as a criticism. Vea tilted her head, in the Varathi gesture of considered thought. No, she said. It is the highest category of compliment in our strategic language. It describes an entity that cannot be rushed into defeat, because it does not understand defeat as a final state. We have not encountered it before, outside of theoretical models. I thanked her. I meant it. 1 year after the first signing, I stood in the Hall of Concordance again. The same crystal dome overhead, the same pale light. No smell of burnt sugar this time. The Varathi body chemistry did not produce that scent, under conditions of genuine negotiation, it turned out. The room smelled instead like cool air and something I could not name, which one of the junior translators told me was the equivalent of deliberate calm. The treaty in front of me was 48 pages long. We had spent 5 weeks reducing it from 220. Every clause had been argued, every term had been disputed, every implication had been followed to its end before it was agreed upon. It was not a perfect document. No treaty between two parties who had tried to destroy each other 3 times in 11 years could be perfect. But it was honest, which was a different kind of value. Petra stood at my shoulder. She had been assigned to my diplomatic team in the last 2 weeks of negotiations, because Okafor had told someone above my clearance level that she was exactly the kind of person we needed in the room, and that person had agreed. She was right, as far as I could tell, about most things she had opinions on. Counselor Vea stood across the table. She was signing first, which had been a small victory in itself. The Varathi tradition was for the lesser party to sign first, and getting them to agree to go first had taken 2 days and a diagram. She signed. She looked up at me. I signed. I looked up at her. Outside the dome, the lights of Varath Prime were coming on as the sun set. Little by little, the city filling with the soft glow of a civilization that was, for the moment, not at war with mine. I did not know how long that would last. I had learned not to place too much weight on that kind of prediction. I pressed my ring to the edge of the desk as I finished signing. Old habit, as I said. No signal this time. Nothing was waiting on the other end to receive a confirmation, because there was nothing hidden to confirm. No counter-operation ticking forward behind a false front. Just my hand, and the desk, and the ring, and the name I had written in long, clean letters on a document that meant what it said. Petra leaned close to me, as the room erupted in the polite, measured sounds of 2 delegations who are professionally relieved. Why do you keep pressing that ring? She asked quietly. I looked at her. I looked at the desk. I thought about Owen at 2 in the morning. About Admiral Cho's face over a report she set down like glass. About Dre Okafor eating bread rolls in the dark between stars. Because the first time I pressed it, I said, it meant something. And I suppose I want to remember the difference. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the difference between a real promise and a fake one? The difference, I said, between signing something because you have to, and signing something because you mean it. She nodded slowly, like someone filing a thing away for later. I understood that. There was a lot from the last 18 months that I was still filing away myself, still trying to organize into a shape I could carry without it shifting. Outside, the city glittered. Somewhere in deep space, Dre Okafor was flying a legitimate cargo to people who needed it. Somewhere in a facility without a map, Owen was probably still working, probably still on his fourth cup of coffee, probably flagging something that someone had hoped would go unnoticed. And somewhere in the Kethis Nebula, the remnants of the Fourth Fleet were making their way home, carrying with them the knowledge that humanity was not what they had believed we were. We were something harder to calculate, something that did not measure time the way they did, that did not treat the word patience as a strategy but as a nature, something that had absorbed 3 wars and 1 billion dead, and come back to a table and signed a document with steady hands, knowing the signing itself was the first move in the next part of a very long game. We had not won because we were stronger. We had not won because we were smarter, or faster, or built for war in ways they were not. We had won, if winning was even the right word, because we had been willing to wait, willing to plan past the edges of what any single person in the plan could see, willing to trust each other with pieces of a picture that none of us held completely. Counselor Vea caught my eye across the room and offered the gesture that their culture used for mutual completion. I returned it with a handshake, which she had learned to accept in the weeks of negotiation. We had a lot left to figure out: the mining systems, the resource rights, the framework for future disputes, the question of what to do about the Varathi war faction that still existed and still had supporters in their political system. All of that was ahead, but we were both still there to figure it out. That was the thing I kept coming back to, not the victory, not the strategy, not the elegant precision of an 18-month deception that had delivered exactly the outcome it was built for. What I kept coming back to was the simple fact of still being there. 1 billion people who were gone could not be brought back by a perfect treaty or a clever plan. But the billions who were still alive, on colony worlds and station rings and spinning habitats, people who would never know how close it had come, who would live their ordinary days in peace without understanding the machinery that had made that peace possible, they were there. And that, I had decided a long time ago, was enough to carry. I picked up my briefing documents, shook several hands, accepted 2 formal Varathi bow gestures from officials I had not met before, and walked out of the Hall of Concordance into the cool evening air of a city that did not smell like victory tonight. It smelled like rain coming in from the eastern plains. I had not known, until that moment, that Vareth Prime had rain. I stood on the steps of the hall for a minute, just breathing it in. Petra appeared beside me. "Home tomorrow?" she asked. "Home tomorrow," I said. We stood there a little longer, looking out at the lights. Then we went inside, to do the last of the paperwork, because peace, like everything else worth having, requires a great deal of ordinary work to maintain.